Welcome into the FanDuel Hurry Up. It's Maria Marino for Fantasy Sports Network, joined by Number Fire's Jim Sonis as well, previewing the Super Bowl once again. We've been talking about it from every single angle, and today we're going to dive deeper into strategies specifically for the single game Super Bowl slate on FanDuel. And the first strategy we want to highlight, courtesy of Jim, is that quarterbacks are safe for that MVP spot within your lineup. Jim, why is that?
Yeah, I think this is kind of something that's true in general for fantasy, just because quarterbacks have such a good floor from a fantasy perspective because they touch the ball every play. You can kind of predict how their scoring will go. But I think for this game specifically, it makes even more sense to go with either Tom Brady or Jared Goff in that MVP slot, just because in general, I think with these two specific teams, the quarterback scoring is going to be your most reliable source for fantasy outputs because you look at the backfields here, it's split between CJ Anderson and Todd Gurley for the Rams, and then it's a three-headed backfield for the Patriots, and you don't really know who's going to go off in a given week between those two backfields. Same thing is less so true at receiver, but still partially there because you got Robert Woods and Brandon Cooks for the Rams, but the Patriots corners are really good. They can kind of nullify wide receivers. And on the Patriots side, you do have Edelman. But I kind of think that from an Edelman perspective, his biggest strength is his floor rather than his upside. So I'm not really super inclined to put Edelman in my MVP slot. So that kind of does leave us with the quarterbacks more often than not. Looking back at past Super Bowls, the quarterback has been the highest scoring player from a fantasy perspective. Two of the past five times, they have been the second highest or third highest score in the other three games as well. So I kind of think that if you're looking for safety out of your MVP slot, you kind of want to bank in that really good production. It does make most sense to go with a quarterback there. And I think that the quarterbacks in general are just the safest outlets for this game. So when I'm looking at the single game slate, I really do think a quarterback will be in my MVP slot a pretty good percentage of the time.
Right. And as you mentioned, it's just harder, a little bit harder to predict out of all of these offensive weapons that are out there, which one is actually going to go off. Whereas you assume that both of these quarterbacks are going to be productive. It should be relatively high scoring, a close game that should see a lot of points, which means you feel good about putting your MVP as a quarterback. Now, we talked about for the Pro Bowl how wide receivers you liked at MVP.
Yeah.
This is obviously completely opposite. This is more in tune to a regular game scenario, but you say wide receivers a little troublesome in the MVP spot.
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of instances during the regular season which I would use a wide receiver in the MVP slot. Like thinking back to Thursday Night Football, way back early in the year, I think that it made a lot of sense to use AJ Green in your MVP slot for one of the games just because he had like a 30% target market share at the time. We know he has monster upside. So if you have a wide receiver who has just this monster market share, in those instances, I do think it does make sense to put those players in your MVP slot. But when you look at this specific game, there are no pass catchers in general who have market shares that are that high. Robert Woods around 27% for the Rams, but doesn't get a lot of work downfield, which does cap his upside. Julian Edelman, he has 26% of the Patriots' targets in the playoffs. That's a pretty good number, and he does get work down the field. But Edelman's strength is going to be in his safety. It's not going to be in his upside, which means he's not super conducive to that MVP slot. So basically what you're getting is spread out production for these wide receivers within this game. And that's kind of scary for me from an MVP perspective, because if you want a wide receiver to go off and be kind of this lone ranger who goes off and not bring the quarterback along with him, you want him to be getting almost all of the team's targets in that specific game. That's probably not going to happen for any of the wide receivers between the Patriots and the Rams. So basically, if we assume that Edelman does go off, that probably means that Tom Brady will go off as well, with dragging, guys like Chris Hogan, Rob Gronkowski, James White along the way. So to me, I think that if I assume a wide receiver does do well, I'll probably just be more inclined to put their quarterback in the MVP slot than that wide receiver specifically. This is not to talk down upon all wide receivers in this game. I think that they are really attractive, as we'll talk about in a second. But as far as the MVP slot goes, I think that I'd be more inclined to use either a quarterback or a running back there rather than a wide receiver.
It seems kind of simple, but maybe not the most obvious logic. You make a really good point. If one of these receivers, for example, is going to go off, why not have the quarterback be in your MVP spot where you're reaping those benefits anyway? It just makes sense and it just seems like a really smart way to go about it. Moving on to our next strategy, wide receivers are valuable in other spots throughout your single game lineup for the Super Bowl. Why do you say that?
Yeah, I think that when you look at the salaries on the wide receivers for this game, that's kind of the thing that I do like about them. And I think that I'm going to wind up using them quite a bit, even if they don't wind up in my MVP slot, because outside of Edelman, they're all pretty cheap. Brandon Cooks is down at 11.5. You got Robert Woods at 10.5, and then also Josh Reynolds as a pretty big value play on the Rams side. So from a salary perspective, the wide receivers are pretty good, but also if you look back at past Super Bowls, you tend to have a lot of wide receivers among the top five scorers in that game, which is what I want to find. I want to pinpoint those top five scorers and get those guys on my roster. If you look at the top five scorers for the past 5 years, the average is that there have been 2.2 wide receivers within that top five per year. There's been only one season in which there were not two wide receivers. That was back in 2017. But every other year, there have been at least two. There were actually four wide receivers among the top five in scoring back in 2014. So I think that you're probably going to wind up having multiple wide receivers in most of the lineups you fill out, just because they do tend to score well. They also benefit from playing inside a dome, which is good for wide receivers. And again, they save you a lot of salary. You've got some pretty good options in that lower salary tier with guys like Chris Hogan and Josh Reynolds getting good market shares, Philip Dorsett down there as well. So I'm going to use wide receivers, and I think that I will be very okay with using them for this specific slate. I just don't think that'll be in the MVP slot. So kind of conflicting points here. Maybe don't use them in the MVP slot, but I think they're good overall, which may be counterintuitive. But I do think overall, wide receivers do deserve to be on a pretty good number of your roster slots.
Okay, so just to clarify, we like quarterback at MVP the most,
Yes.
and we like wide receivers in pretty much any other slot. And it's a great way to get some value and be able to save a little bit of your salary. Up next, quarterbacks. Let's talk about them even further. And using both of them often, that's what you're recommending. Are you going to have a lot of lineups with both quarterbacks?
Most likely, yeah. I think that that's kind of the way to go for this slate because when you look at the two teams specifically, it's a lot of spread out production, especially with the Rams sprinkling in CJ Anderson in the backfield for this Rams team. If you look at Number Fire's projections for this game, both Jared Goff and Tom Brady are expected to score more than 18 FanDuel points. Nobody else is projected to score more than 13 and a half. So it's a pretty big gap from Tom Brady and Jared Goff down to the rest of the pack. On top of that, the salaries for these two guys are not super restrictive. They're both $15,500, which I think honestly is a bit of a bargain. During the regular season, you would see guys, at the quarterback position who'd be priced $16,500, $17,000 for these single game slates. So the salary's not bad for Jared Goff and Tom Brady. The projections like both these guys quite a bit. And historically, it's been good to have both quarterbacks in your lineup, especially if you assume this game will feature a pretty good number of points. If we look at the top five scorers in Super Bowl lineups over the past 5 years, 3 of the past 5 years, both quarterbacks have been among the top five in scoring. That was in 2018, 2017, and 2015. If you look back to 2014, the game of football back then was pretty different than it is now, with passing being a lot further emphasized. So with 3 of the past 4 years having two quarterbacks in the top five in scoring, I'm inclined to trust that quite a bit and go with both Jared Goff and Tom Brady in my lineup. So you can kind of switch things up. You put Brady in your MVP slot for one, put Goff in your MVP slot for the other. So there are different ways you can change things up while getting both quarterbacks in there. But I think with the spread out volume that both these teams have right now, I think that there is a lot of safety and a lot of allure in plugging in Jared Goff and Tom Brady and just going from there.
Well, we've already established that the quarterbacks really have the best floor of any position as we head into this single game slate. And what helps the whole idea or the whole strategy of using both of them is the other strategy, which you mentioned as well, where you can plug in some wide receivers for some bargain prices and get some value. So I like that both quarterbacks as well are they're pricey, but not completely out of the question pricey. So up next, let's talk about running backs now. And one strategy that you like for the single game slate for the Super Bowl is using the running back of the winning team. Now, that must mean you know who's going to win, Jim.
Yeah, I think that we're joking about that, Maria. But at the same time, if you're building a lineup, you kind of have to make these assumptions. So,
Yes.
like, if I fill out a lineup, I want to assume in that specific lineup that the Rams win 100% of the time, because within that specific lineup, it's the Rams are either going to win or they're not. That's how the outcome is going to be. So when you're building a lineup, you want to assume, like, you want to play the Swami and be able to assume, hey, I know with 100% certainty that the Patriots will win in a blowout or that the Rams win a close game. Once you make that assumption, you can build from there. But pretty much no matter what assumption you build, you're going to have a running back who will benefit from that assumption. And running backs do tend to score well when they're on the winning team. Last year, or 2 years ago, I should say, James White had the highest score in that game by a pretty wide margin. He was on the winning team in that one. CJ Anderson would have been your MVP slot back in 2016. He was on the winning team as well. Even last year, when it was a huge shootout and the Eagles had this kind of split backfield, both Corey Clement and LeGarrette Blount scored more fantasy points than any of the Patriots running backs did. So there's a lot of value in pinpointing the running back who will be on the winning team. So if you're filling out a lineup, fill it out under the assumption that that the Rams win. If you assume that, you could either assume that Todd Gurley or CJ Anderson will get a lot of volume and have a really good day. So, and I think that for the Patriots, the obvious one there is Sony Michel, because he's gotten so much volume when they have been ahead. On top of that, both these teams can run the ball efficiently. So if they do get a lead and are able to hang on to it, they're going to run the ball pretty efficiently. So I think you do just want to make assumptions. Like, when you're filling out a lineup, assume a tight game, assume a blowout game, whether it's favoring the Rams or the Patriots, but make that assumption in your head and build your lineup based on that assumption. And most of those assumptions will lead you to getting either a Patriots running back or a Rams running back on your team.
I really like this idea of determining different game script scenarios. And if you want to play in more than one contest and put out a few different lineups kind of to reflect how you think the game might go. I do think that's really fun. And then, of course, if you just want to go all in on one lineup and try to project it, I think that's actually really fun too. So it's kind of a win-win all around. And just real quick, are you leaning Patriots?
So I got to confess that I'm a fairly degenerate Jared Goff fan. So it's hard for me to pick
Okay.
against Jared Goff. So if you forced me, Maria, to pick right now, who would I pick? I would probably pick the Patriots,
Okay.
but I think the odds of the Patriots winning are a little bit lower than the public seems to think it is based on the way the betting has gone. So in general, I favor the Patriots, but I think I'm more into the Rams than the public is right now. I think that's the most political I can possibly get with my
Yeah.
answer and just kind of, ride both sides of the fence, but give me both. How about that?
I ultimate hedge, but
Yeah.
sorry, I digress. I just wanted to get that out there. We still have one more strategy to discuss when it comes to the single game slate for the Super Bowl, and that is using our old friends, our dear friends, the kickers. There's a couple of good kickers. I would say probably two of the best kickers in the league will be playing in this Super Bowl, and they have a good floor.
They absolutely do. And I think that when you're looking at players in this kind of middle to lower tier from a salary perspective, you can see guys who have really good ceilings. Like, I think that Josh Reynolds has a path to a good game because, we know that the mantra of the Patriots defense is take away the best options. That could lead to a lot for Reynolds. Chris Hogan catch a deep ball every now and then. Rob Gronkowski, maybe he goes out on top in his potentially final game. All those guys have a path to at least a decent ceiling. But from a floor perspective, none of those players are on par with what you get from both Steven Gostkowski and Greg Zuerlein. So I think that there is a lot of allure in using these guys here. Gostkowski averaged 8.5 points per game this year. He had at least 4 points in every game this year and at least 8 FanDuel points. In 12 of 18 games, Greg Zuerlein had at least 7 points in every game this year from a FanDuel perspective. So, like, the floors for these guys are really good, and they're going to be better than what you get from those lower dollar plays. So I don't think that the ceiling is bad for the lower tier plays. But I think if you're looking for floor, it's pretty attractive to plug in a kicker because if you plug in a kicker, what you're doing is you are allowing yourself to be less fragile if the four other players on your roster do go off. So I think what I'll do is kind of go back to the assumption game, Maria, where I assume that either the Patriots or the Rams will win and fill up my lineup based on that. And the winning kicker is going to be a pretty good selection because you're implying that team will score points. They'll probably have chances at field goals late in the game. So at kicker and at running back, you want to make the assumption that one team wins and build the lineup based on that. And it'll be a pretty clear winner based on, which kicker you decide to use. So I think that that's the way I'd play it there. And if you want to go for floor, the kickers are pretty good options where they're priced at for this weekend.
All right, you hear that? Forget the stigma when it comes to kickers in single game DFS. All right, Jim and I are going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we are going to discuss some game proposition bets via FanDuel Sportsbook. I'm so excited. Don't go anywhere. We're back on the FanDuel Hurry Up. Maria Marino for Fantasy Sports Network and Number Fire's Jim Sannes to preview some of the proposition bets available via FanDuel Sportsbook. There are so many fun ones to choose from. We're going to highlight some of Jim's favorites right now. And the first one is the projected rushing yard total for the game. Both teams combined is at about 213.5 yards. And Jim, you think we're going to go over that number?
Yeah, I think that when you look at these two teams, it's two really smart defensive coordinators. Essentially, Brian Flores and Bill Belichick for the Patriots, and then Wade Phillips for the Rams. And both of these teams are analytically minded. Although the Patriots never admit that, they put a lot of stock in numbers. And I think that they both understand that it is in their best interest to force the opposing team to run the football because rushing in general is less efficient than passing. And both these offenses have good rushing offenses as well, so they can take advantage of that. So I kind of think if I'm looking at this game overall, I would expect there to be a tiny bit more rushing than there is projected to be based on the total for this game, up at 57 points, and also based on this prop here, 213.5 rushing yards in this game. Number Fire's projections agree. Right now, they project there to be 238.6 rushing yards in this game between the two teams combined. And I think that a lot of it can come down from the winner of this game, whoever that winds up being, because the Patriots in their two playoff wins have 155 yards rushing and 176 yards rushing. The Rams had 273 all by themselves against the Cowboys, and then 77 against the Saints in a pretty stout rush defense there. So the winning team in this game, they could go over this by themselves. And honestly, I think that, around 150 or so is probably a pretty realistic expectation for the winning team in this game, which means that the losing team would need, roughly 63 or so to hit that over. So there is some juice on the over here at minus 160. But I think even with that being considered, I think that there is enough here. Looking at these two offenses, looking at the way the defensive coordinators will likely think going into this one, where I would expect there to be a pretty good amount of rushing in this game. So I think that the over here does make a lot of sense.
The running games for both of these teams have been productive throughout this postseason so far. Obviously, Sony Michel with the Patriots, and then on the Rams side, whether it's CJ Anderson or I think as many DFS players and bettors are hoping Todd Gurley, they've still been somewhat efficient. I think that's a pretty safe bet. Let's move on to another prop bet. Julian Edelman to lead in receiving yards. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, Edelman right now is the favorite to lead in receiving yards, which I don't generally want to do that, but I think for this specific game, it does make a lot of sense. Number Fire's projections currently have Edelman projected to lead this game with 72.59 receiving yards. Robert Woods is second. He is at 66 receiving yards, and Brandon Cooks is the only other guy projected to get more than 54 receiving yards. So it's basically a pretty small pool of players who could lead this game in receiving yardage. And among those guys, I think that Edelman has the safest path to having a good amount of yardage in this game because, with Brandon Cooks and Robert Woods, Bill Belichick is going to do whatever he can to try to slow those two guys down. So it could lead to Josh Reynolds, but Reynolds is not a guy who gets a lot of receiving yardage in general, at least from an upside perspective. So I kind of think that Edelman does make a lot of sense here. Gets 26% of the Patriots' targets. That is in addition to 33% of their deep targets, looking at just the playoffs. So he gets a lot of overall yard or a lot of overall volume, but also some volume down the field, which can lead to that yardage pretty quickly for Edelman. So I think that it's not overly attractive to bet the favorite here. Edelman is plus 250 to lead in receiving yardage, but based on the projections and just based on thinking about this game anecdotally, I think it does lead towards Edelman being the pretty easy selection to lead this game. So at plus 250, I think I can get behind him at that number.
I really like the idea of Julian Edelman, uh, as the favorite leading and receiving yards, just considering the fact that if we like the Patriots to win, as we've talked about, just with DFS, but also with betting, kind of making bets and assumptions along those lines. I think Tom Brady's going to do well. Julian Edelman's his favorite receiver. He's been here before. It's again just something you feel good about, something fun to bet on. Let's move on to another prop bet that you like. And there's one available on FanDuel, which says any wide receiver or tight end will have 100 receiving yards. Tell me why you think this is a good one to go with.
Yeah, I went with no here at plus 115, partly because when you look at the receivers in this game, it's kind of back to what we discussed earlier on, Maria, where it's kind of spread out production. I did just talk about Edelman getting this concentrated production for the Patriots, but even with him, he's getting just 26% of the team's targets and 33% of the deep targets. Like, those aren't overwhelming numbers. Number Fire's projections right now, again, have Edelman leading with 73 receiving yards, and he'd have to go pretty well over that in order to hit the over here for 100 receiving yards. Only 5 players are projected to have more than 46 receiving yards. So it's kind of a small pool of players who could top that 100-yard barrier. And again, it also goes back to what we discussed before at the rushing, where I can see this being a game that does feature a pretty good number of rushing attempts. And if that does happen, that's going to suppress passing volume, which will put a bigger emphasis on the possibility we just don't see anybody get to that 100 yardage marker. The Rams have good slot corner play and Nickel Roby-Coleman when he's not pass interfering out there, at least. So there is good corner play to keep Edelman in check. So I like Edelman a lot. But I think there's a pretty good chance the Rams keep him beneath that 100 yardage marker. And I think when you see that the no on this one is plus 115, it does make a lot of sense to side with that. So I think it's largely the number they're giving me here, with the no being plus 115, that makes me side with saying all players will be under that number. Number Fire's projections think that'll be the case, and I'm willing to buy into that as well.
Number Fire's projections have been pretty darn on point all season. You've been pretty on point for the most part. Just kidding. So no, of course, I respect the logic. Let's talk about another prop bet. And this one has to do with the GOAT, Tom Brady. You think that he will be the quarterback to throw the first interception of the game. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't want to, get any negative Tom Brady stuff out there, because Patriots fans can be tiny bit vocal on Twitter. So I don't want to go right. I don't want to go out here too much, but I think just from a numbers perspective, this one does make sense, because Brady to throw the first pick is plus 100 right now in FanDuel Sportsbook. And, honestly, with Number Fire's projections, Brady is projected to throw more picks than Goff. He is at 0.78, whereas Goff is at 0.70. We remember, back in the conference championship, that Brady did throw 2 picks in that game. He had a third, actually, that was called back by the Dee Ford offsides penalty. And overall, Brady has thrown 13 picks this year when you count the playoffs, which is the exact same number as Goff. And this Rams defense has been really good ever since Aqib Talib came back. They've allowed negative 0.05 passing net expected points per dropback based on Number Fire's metrics. The league average is at 0.12. So they've been a really good defense ever since Aqib Talib came back. I do think that the Patriots defense has a lot of talent. But when you put Aqib Talib on that Rams team, I think that if I had to pick one, I'd probably pick the Rams defense if I had to pick one straight up. So I think that overall, I think it's pretty even odds that Jared Goff or Tom Brady winds up throwing the first pick in this game. So if I'm getting Tom Brady at exactly plus 100, when it's really hard to find any value in prop bets for the Super Bowl because people are so jazzed to bet on it, I think I'm going to take that. So, it could be Goff. It could be Johnny Hecker maybe throwing that first pick, but I do think that that Tom Brady of those selections would be my favorite.
I could see why people are jazzed. I'm pretty jazzed, but it's really the numbers game that you're playing there with why you're selecting Tom Brady in that scenario, which I appreciate. So let's move on to our pal Todd Gurley and Sony Michelle on the Patriots side. So in talking about sort of how this run game scenario on each side is going to play out, this proposition bet has Gurley reaching 50 rushing yards before Michelle does. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, a lot of it comes down to just a numbers game, Maria, because when you look at these two backfields, Todd Gurley is fighting with one guy, that's CJ Anderson, whereas Sony Michelle is fighting with two in Rex Burkhead and James White. So if we're looking at getting production quickly early in the game, that kind of does favor Todd Gurley over Sony Michelle because when is Michelle at his best? He is at his best late in the ball game when the Patriots are ahead and can grind down clock. That's going to make him a little bit less favorable for a prop like this than he would be if we were betting on rushing totals for the entire game. If we look at this, the matchups too, I think that it's actually a game that sets up for a pretty good amount of Todd Gurley because the weakness of this Patriots defense is in the speed of their linebackers. That is why Kareem Hunt had 5 receptions for 105 yards against them. We saw Tariq Cohen get 8 receptions for 69 yards. LaShawn McCoy had 82 receiving yards. You can exploit this team with backs out of the backfield. But, again, that doesn't relate to rushing. So why are we talking about that here as it relates to from a rushing perspective for Todd Gurley? I just think that what that's going to lead to is Todd Gurley being on the field more often than CJ Anderson. And if you give me Todd Gurley in his regular role against this Patriots defense and give me plus 150 that he'll get to 50 rushing yards before Sony Michelle, I'm inclined to take that. So I think it's a couple of things to line up here, whether it be the number of guys in the backfield for the Rams compared to the Patriots, whether it be the anecdote around the way they could use Gurley compared to CJ Anderson in this game, or the thinking about when Sony Michelle gets his rushing yardage. Those things do funnel me towards taking Gurley straight up over Sony Michelle plus 150 to get to 50 rushing yards first, just because I think that there are a lot of factors that could lead to this being a good game for Todd Gurley.
I think this is music to a lot of people's ears, Jim. And I just like to point out, if you watch this program, you probably have noticed already that the notes at the bottom of the screen are pretty snarky, pretty witty. And I just want to shout out to our producer, our exec producer, Greg Sussman, for being super creative and funny. Make sure you read the bottom of the screen. That's all I'm going to say. Now, let's move on to one more proposition bet that you like. This one is the distance of the shortest successful field goal being over 25 and a half yards. Why do you think that's a good bet to make?
It could just be because I have too much faith in the intelligence of these head coaches to not to kick a field goal that short. Because you look back to last week, I was super enraged with Sean McVay kicking a field goal from the 1 yard line. 'Cause it's like, dude, like you're supposed to be the super smart coach. Like just try to score here, man.
Yeah.
Like I was pretty mad about that. So you're looking back at what these teams have done this year because it got me kind of worried about this one. The anecdote around McVay doing that last week, but I think in general, these two teams didn't kick a lot of super short field goals for this year. This would be from the 8 yard line or closer for a 25-yard field goal. The Rams did kick 10 field goals of that length or shorter this year, but it usually was not against super high-powered offenses. They did it once against the Chiefs. They did it twice against the Seahawks, but all other short field goals for them were against basically duds, teams they were much better than and were projected to win that game pretty steadily. The Patriots attempted 7 field goals that were shorter than 26 yards this year. One was against the Vikings, another was against the Chiefs, but again, all the others were against dud teams that the Patriots should win by a pretty good amount by. So when you're looking at these two teams, if you're going to keep up with the Patriots or keep up with the Rams, you got to get touchdowns and not field goals. So I think that what that will do is key these two teams to be more aggressive once they are inside the 10-yard line for this game. So they had combined 17 field goals of that length this year, and only 5 of them were against really good opponents. So to me, I think we're going to see field goals in this game for sure. That's why I like Zerline and Gostkowski for DFS. But I think when they do so, it will be in situations where they're not as close to the goal line. So I'm going to take the over on this one, minus 115. So bookmakers kind of agree here that it is more likely to be longer than 25 and a half yards. But I think that is the right way to go given the mindsets of these two head coaches.
I think it totally makes sense. And what's interesting is if you're in field goal range, a little farther away from the goal line, you might be more inclined
Mhm.
to kick a field goal because these kickers are pretty solid. But you would hope that if you can get inside the red zone, et cetera, that you're going to be able to go for it and punch it in because once again, it's going to be tough for both of these teams to keep up with their respective opponents. All right, Jim Sonis of Number Fire. Thanks so much for your suggestions, as always. Thank you to those of you out there who are watching this program. Remember, you can always get more content by going to fanduel.com/theduel and clicking on videos and subscribing to our YouTube channel at the Fantasy Sports Network. Thanks once again. It's been fun. Enjoy the big game, everybody. Take care.